Those of you who have been following my channel for a while are probably aware that one of the first topics which I attempted to delve into in detail was the theory of morphic resonance, as developed by the British biologist and philosopher of science, Rupert Sheldrake. We've definitely covered a lot of ground since those early videos, and I've also made some rather substantial progress in refining my own process of creating these videos, and so in this video, I'm going to be attempting to return to the theory of morphic resonance again, and cover that topic in a more polished way in a single video. I think that returning to this topic is important, in part because a number of the ideas which I've worked through in more recent videos either imply or elaborate upon the theory of morphic resonance in certain ways, but also because my own thinking has come to develop since I created those initial videos addressing this topic. I have more to say now, and I'd like to contextualize those thoughts in a more thorough exegesis of the topic in general, especially for those who haven't seen my earlier videos on morphic resonance already. Moreover, I think this is a topic worth returning to simply because I think that the theory of morphic resonance is itself a very important idea for a number of reasons. I don't think of morphic resonance as another fringe scientific idea, which we should regard as a mere curiosity among many other outlandish yet intriguing hypotheses developed by eccentric scientists. Morphic resonance is, I believe, an idea which is of immense philosophical and metaphysical significance, and one which I think can serve as a very important entry point into a way of seeing nature itself in a manner that goes far beyond the bounds of mechanistic materialism. An ideology with which modern academic science has gleefully tied its own hands behind its back, and which I believe has long outlasted its expiration date. In this video, we are going to be looking at the way in which Rupert Sheldrake himself came to develop the theory of morphic resonance. We are going to be looking at the details of the theory. We are going to be looking at how the theory relates to the metaphysical frameworks developed by philosophers such as Henri Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead. We are going to be looking at how morphic resonance relates to more recent research regarding bioelectric fields, which has been popularized by developmental biologist Dr. Michael Levin. We are going to be looking at various lines of empirical evidence which might support the veracity of morphic resonance, and finally we will be looking at what some of the broader implications of this theory might be with regards to cosmology, the nature of the mind, and various forms of so-called parapsychological phenomena. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. Rupert Sheldrake, born June 28 of 1942, began to develop an acute interest in zoology and botany during the earliest years of his adolescence. His father, a pharmacist and amateur microscopist, was very encouraging of his son's scientific enthusiasm. Much like myself, Sheldrake had, by the age of 14, renounced the religious beliefs of his family and culture in favor of a thoroughly materialistic atheism, noting that he was the only student within his Anglican boarding school to refuse to undergo the standard religious confirmation ceremony. In an interview with The Guardian, he stated, quote, "I had bought into the package deal of science equals atheism," end quote. Prior to beginning his university education, Sheldrake would work at a pharmacology research lab. Sheldrake would later recount that this experience was particularly impactful, as he was deeply unsettled by the manner in which the animals involved in the experiments conducted by the lab were required to be euthanized by the experimenters. In the years that followed, Sheldrake would go on to study biology and biochemistry at Clare College, Cambridge, later going on to study philosophy and history of science at Harvard University in the United States, and finally returning to Cambridge to receive his PhD in biochemistry through his research regarding the developmental hormones of plants. Having returned to Clare College, and now with funding by the prestigious Royal Society Rosenheim Research Fellowship, Sheldrake would go on to engage in research regarding the biochemistry of plant morphogenesis. This research centered upon the role played by auxins, a form of plant hormone, in the differentiation of vascular plant tissues. Together with his research partner Philip Rubry, Sheldrake would develop a theory of polar auxin transport, by which osmotic processes regulate the distribution of auxin hormones throughout plant tissues, and thereby play a role in determining the somatic forms which such plants come to assume throughout the course of their development. Ultimately, however, Sheldrake would become disillusioned with this line of research, and with the assumptions which he and his colleagues had been making with regards to the nature of such developmental processes. Sheldrake would later go on to say that the theory being developed through this research was inextricably circular, such that it was unable to actually explain differences in plant development between species. Plants with the exact same auxin transport systems nonetheless came to develop in drastically different ways, and as such, auxin transport processes were unable to explain actual differences between different morphogenetic processes. Having abandoned his initial research program, Sheldrake would then set his sights eastward, coming to work at the University of Malaya from 1968 to 1969, and then relocating to Hyderabad, India, where he would once again devote himself to research regarding plant physiology and morphogenesis, now working with the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. During these years, Sheldrake would also begin to take a serious interest in Indic philosophy and mysticism, studying various forms of meditation and spiritual practices. It was during this time that Sheldrake would begin to formulate a theory which he believed might be able to resolve the problems which he initially encountered during his studies of plant morphogenesis, and it was this thinking which would eventually culminate in the theory of morphic resonance. In 1978, Sheldrake would begin to work on a book which would come to be published in 1981 as A New Science of Life, and which would later be republished, revised, and expanded to become Morphic Resonance, the Nature of Formative Causation. Within this text, Sheldrake argues that the development of biological morphologies cannot be explained simply as a result of mechanistic processes, in which organic wholes are understood as merely aggregations of smaller parts. Sheldrake proposes instead that organic physiology and behavior must be understood as being shaped by a kind of resonance, by which self-organizing systems are able to both perpetuate themselves and influence one another on the basis of formal similarity between morphogenetic fields. Morphic fields, Sheldrake argues, are patterns of growth, development, and behavior which are able to inform one another across space and time. Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance implies that DNA molecules are not, in fact, the primary units of heredity among living organisms, in contrast to the Neo-Darwinian paradigm within which genetic replicators are regarded as the fundamental determining factor in shaping living systems. DNA code plays the undoubtedly consequential role of coding for protein synthesis, but Sheldrake argues that such protein synthesis is not the primary means by which the morphology of organisms is directed. Instead, organic forms are fields which direct, yet do not fully determine, morphological development by influencing the behavior of the self-organizing processes which comprise living entities. Before moving on to address Sheldrake's claims pertaining to morphic resonance per se, I first would like to direct our attention towards the more basic notion of morphogenetic fields. Rupert Sheldrake did not himself develop the concept of morphogenetic fields within developmental biology. Rather, this idea has its roots in the early 20th century, originally being proposed in 1910 by the Russian biologist Alexander G. Gurwitch. A morphogenetic field can be understood as a kind of matrix of relationality, within which an aggregation of living cells are able to coordinate with one another so as to condition the development of higher-order morphological features such as tissues, organs, and organ systems. Such fields are holistic systems, somewhat akin to electromagnetic fields. When one cuts a magnet in half, what results is not a separate north and south pole for each half, but rather two complete magnets, each with their own north and south pole. Similarly, when embryonic structures are divided in such a way, the two halves of the embryo come to form two complete organisms, rather than two half-organisms. Although the notion of morphogenetic fields enjoyed some degree of popularity during the early decades of the 20th century, particularly within the field of embryology, Sheldrake notes that early iterations of this notion suffered from a great deal of ambiguity. Oftentimes, theorists were not clear as to whether or not morphogenetic fields were intended to refer to a new type of field, perhaps akin to electromagnetic fields, or if the notion was simply intended to refer only to shared behavior of groups of living cells. Was the notion of a morphogenetic field best understood as referring to a new kind of phenomenon, or was the term best understood as a new way of thinking about processes which were already accounted for by mainstream physics, chemistry, and biology? Within Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, morphogenetic fields are understood as definitively causal entities, which are able to direct developmental, behavioral, regenerative, and cognitive processes in a manner that cannot be reduced to entirely mechanistic forms of causation. This notion of morphogenetic fields would come to fall heavily out of favor with the eventual rise of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, a paradigm within biology which would hold sway throughout the remainder of the 20th century and which retains a degree of dominance even to the present day. One of the fundamental conjectures of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis was that organic systems were determined predominantly by sequences of DNA, which were regarded as being the basic units of heredity. With the discovery of the twisted ladder of DNA in 1953 by Rosalind Franklin, James Watson, and Francis Crick, it was pronounced that science had finally discovered what genes were physically made of. Strings of base pairs encoded within the strands of DNA determined the synthesis of proteins, and it was concluded that this process of synthesis was the means by which phenotypic differences arise within living organisms and the means by which such phenotypic traits are inherited through biological lineages. Darwinian natural selection would then act upon gene pools in an algorithmic manner, filtering out sequences of DNA which were less capable of ensuring their replication through the phenotypic traits which they conditioned. Natural selection, in other words, would algorithmically select for DNA sequences which express themselves as fitness-enhancing phenotypic traits. The whole history of evolution could then be understood as the procedural advance of a blind watchmaker, as described by Richard Dawkins. Evolution came to be understood as entirely blind and mechanical, and organisms were understood to be the squishy machines, the watches, which were created by this blind and purposeless process. Squishy machines that were entirely at the mercy of whatever sequences of DNA happened to be found within their bodies. With very few notable exceptions, such as the Baldwin effect, there was no role for agency or consciousness in directing the course of evolution, and no need for such concepts as morphogenetic fields. Morphic fields were deemed to be simply unnecessary, as it was declared that the mystery of life had, in essence, been effectively solved. The future of biology would simply be a matter of determining how various DNA sequences came to be shaped by natural selection, and how such DNA sequences then resulted in the physiological and behavioral characteristics of the squishy machines which we call life forms. The dominance of this paradigm can be seen even in colloquial language, as the word gene, a term which initially denoted heritable traits, has now come to be understood as referring specifically to DNA sequences. Along with this solidification of the Neo-Darwinian paradigm, the effects of the Cold War would also come into play. The theory of evolution by the inheritance of acquired characteristics, originally proposed by the pre-Darwinian biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, remained influential within the Soviet Union long after the theory had been abandoned by Western scientists. As such, the theory came to be ridiculed as Soviet pseudoscience by Western biologists. While the theory of morphogenetic fields was potentially congruent with the theory of acquired characteristics, the Neo-Darwinian selfish replicator model was seen to entirely preclude the possibility of such Lamarckian inheritance, and was therefore favored for ideological reasons as much as for empirical reasons. Despite this ideological demonization of Lamarck among Western academics, the 21st century would bring with it explosive developments in the theory of epigenetics, which would reveal quite undeniably that the inheritance of acquired characteristics was indeed very real. The paradigm of Neo-Darwinism remained an almost entirely unquestioned dogma until at least the first decade of the 21st century, and in many regards it remains the central paradigm of mainstream biology even to this day, despite mounting criticisms from many biologists. Recent developments within the fields of developmental biology and epigenetics have shown this paradigm to be standing upon increasingly unstable grounds. The entire field of epigenetic inheritance calls into question many of the central dogmas of Neo-Darwinism. But here I want us to look specifically at the work of biologist Michael Levin of Tufts University in Massachusetts, as Levin's work has come to reaffirm the value and veracity of morphogenetic fields, specifically bioelectric fields, as an essential concept within biology, and his research also helps to illustrate the implications of the morphogenetic field hypothesis for our understanding of life and evolution more generally. Much of Dr. Levin's research has centered upon experiments making use of planarian flatworms of the phylum Platyhelminthes. Planarians demonstrate extraordinary regenerative capabilities, and earlier experiments have demonstrated that planarians are remarkably able to retain memories even after being decapitated and subsequently regenerating their entire head and rudimentary brain. This indicates that the memories of these organisms are not in fact stored within the brain as traditionally assumed, but instead are somehow encoded within the bioelectric fields, which also allow for the regeneration of the organism following dismemberment. By means that are as yet poorly understood, the bioelectric field of such an organism is believed to be able to influence the form of the regenerating brain in such a manner that the creature's behavior continues to accord with learning which occurred prior to dismemberment and subsequent regeneration. Experiments conducted by Dr. Levin and his colleagues have shown that bioelectric fields allow for the transmission of hereditary mutations without any alteration whatsoever to the organism's genetic makeup. Levin's team was able to alter the bioelectric fields of certain planaria such that the organisms, rather than regenerating a missing tail, came to generate a second head instead. As these two-headed planaria came to reproduce, the offspring also generated two heads rather than a tail. A drastic phenotypic mutation was instantiated and inherited with no alteration to the DNA sequences of the organisms, but rather by the manipulation of morphogenetic fields. Levin and his team have also conducted experimental research upon developing tadpole embryos, with equally insightful results. Levin's research team rearranged the developing organs of their frog embryos in random ways. If these organs continued to develop from arrangements which the researchers had artificially imposed, then these embryos would have resulted in the development of horrifically disfigured adults with none of the mature organs arranged in proper relation to one another. Instead, Levin found that these embryonic organs were able to relocate themselves, moving different distances and in different directions, such that the embryos eventually came to develop into perfectly normal adult frogs. The embryonic organs somehow knew that they were not properly arranged in relation to one another and were able to relocate themselves as needed in order to compensate for this. Dr. Levin has conjectured that such phenomena are the result of gradients of stress or unrest between cells, which correspond to distributions of electrical potential between cell membranes. When the arrangements of cells and tissues accord with the pattern prescribed by such a bioelectric field, the cells experience very low unrest and thus proceed to carry on their normal functioning. When there is a disconnect between the arrangement of the cells and the bioelectric field, the cells become stressed in such a manner that they then relocate, reproduce, self-destruct, or differentiate until their stress levels reach a resting state and the correct form of the organism is thereby instantiated. What such research would seem to imply then is that bioelectric information, the information of a kind of morphogenetic field, is that which determines the physiological development of the organisms. As Dr. Levin has stated, it seems to be that the role of DNA is not directly determinative of an organism's overall morphology, but rather that the DNA instead determines the lowest level features of individual cells. DNA provides a sort of toolbox of protein molecules which cells are able to use in order to perform specialized functions. Certain sequences of DNA within a heart cell, for example, allow such cells to perform their functions within heart tissue, but it is not the DNA which actually conditions the morphology of the heart itself. The DNA, in other words, does not itself know what hearts should be shaped like. DNA determines the hardware, as it were, while morphogenetic fields determine higher-level physiological features. Michael Levin's research, although in itself far from a complete validation of Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, is a very serious challenge for the Neo-Darwinian synthesis for a number of reasons. It has been a central shibboleth of the Neo-Darwinian paradigm since its inception that phenotypic traits and hereditary transfer were mediated primarily, if not exclusively, by the information contained within strands of DNA. Units of heredity were dubbed genes, and genes were identified as being sequences of DNA. If heredity, including enormous mutations such as two-headedness, can be passed on without any alteration of DNA, then it must be conceded that hereditary information must be contained elsewhere. If a zany scientist in a lab can produce such a massive mutation via manipulation of bioelectric fields, then it seems almost assured that such fields may come to alter themselves throughout the course of an organism's lifetime. Alterations which, with no mutations of DNA sequences whatsoever, would then be passed on to subsequent generations of such organisms. One implication of this research, then, would be that certain kinds of epigenetic inheritance, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, may have little or nothing to do with mutations of DNA at all, but rather may be adaptations which organisms intentionally create in their efforts to navigate their environments. Of course, the word intention here is very philosophically laden, and this is a topic which we will be returning to in much more detail later on in this video. But for now, what is significant is that this research seems to present the possibility that biological evolution is more than merely a blind algorithmic procedure, but rather a process by which living, holistic systems are able to actively achieve certain forms through self-organization and contribute such achievements unto subsequent generations. For over half a century now, we have commonly regarded genetic characteristics as being immutable characteristics, which we received without our consent from our parents and ancestors. If, on the other hand, our genetic inheritance consists of morphogenetic fields, which we might be able to alter through our own behavior or through interaction with our environment, and which we might then pass on to our children, then the potential implications for the sciences of genetics, medicine, and health research, among others, could be immense. Another implication of Dr. Levin's research might be that the influence of macromutations upon the history of evolution might be far more significant than what has generally been assumed within the Neo-Darwinian paradigm. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the American evolutionary biologist and paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould came under intense scrutiny for his theory of punctuated equilibrium. Gould argued that the evolution of life on Earth was mostly characterized by long periods of relative evolutionary stability, punctuated by periods of rapid speciation and development, which often correlated with ecological and geological catastrophes. Gould was thoroughly criticized and even ridiculed by other evolutionary theorists, most notably Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, who claimed that Gould's theory was untenable, as such rapid jumps forward in evolution would require highly improbable macromutations. In order to understand these criticisms, we need to first look at the notion of the fitness landscape. The fitness landscape is a metaphorical model in which we are to imagine that the vertical dimension of the model's topology corresponds to greater fitness advantage for an organism. Such a model forms a landscape with hills which correspond to greater fitness advantage and valleys which correspond to very low fitness advantage. As all organisms are necessarily born from other organisms which manage to survive and pass on their genes, it can be assumed that the genetic makeup of most organisms will be located near the apex of a fitness hill. Larger mutations, therefore, would be far more likely to put an organism within a valley of very low fitness advantage, while micromutations would have a small but not entirely improbable chance of moving an organism further up a fitness hill. Gould's critics insisted that Darwinian evolution was necessarily a gradualistic process, by which only tiny mutations compound upon one another over the course of millions or billions of years so as to eventually result in large evolutionary transformations. The macro mutations implied by punctuated equilibrium could not play a significant role in evolution, so it was said, as such mutations would result in the characteristics of an organism being very far removed from the hill of optimal fitness which its ancestors had been climbing within their fitness landscape. Thus, only micromutations ever had any real chance of being beneficial to an organism, and therefore evolution must be necessarily gradualistic without any punctuating leaps. This argument seems rather solid if we are assuming that phenotypic characteristics are the direct and immutable result of DNA mutations. Randomly making tiny alterations to the code of your computer program has a very low yet nevertheless real probability of positively impacting the performance of your software. If one were to iterate this process for millions of years, being sure to keep the positive alterations while throwing out the negative changes, then evolution will indeed occur. Alternatively, if you are randomly making very large alterations to your code, it is very likely that you will never get anywhere, as each mutation has such a vanishingly small chance of being a positive alteration that the selection process will be unable to cumulate in a net positive manner. However, if we regard organisms as being truly organic, as being self-organizing systems rather than being squishy computational machines, then it may be that the reality is quite different than this model might imply. A two-headed planarian might not be the best example of a viable macromutation, but two-headed planarians are nevertheless able to survive and reproduce despite being drastically and artificially altered by experimental methods. The organism's tissues and organs are still able to function because they know what they are trying to do, and are smart enough on their own to figure out how to accomplish their goals without those goals being explicitly coded in, as is the case for computer programs. If we are taking such purposive self-organization into consideration, then it isn't difficult to imagine situations in which a macromutation, such as the duplication of a body segment, organ structure, or appendage, might originate as a neutral or even slightly harmful alteration, which then comes to be adapted purposefully by the organism so as to perform tasks which were simply not possible prior to the mutation. Moreover, such mutations may not necessarily be random at all to begin with. If an organism is able to self-organize in such a way that it is able to actively alter its own morphogenetic fields in purposive ways, then the statistical implications of the fitness landscape model might simply be irrelevant regardless. The history of evolution on Earth may prove to have been a punctuated equilibrium after all. Stephen Jay Gould's critics always relied on theoretical considerations for dismissing his conclusions, while Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium was always grounded first and foremost on what was empirically entailed by the actual fossil record itself. If we take into consideration the function of morphogenetic fields in regards to evolutionary history, it seems that Gould may have been right to trust what he actually saw in the empirical evidence above such theoretical considerations. If morphic fields are, as Sheldrake and Levin both suggest, in some sense cognitive, then understanding the process of evolution as the purposeless, mechanical advance of algorithmic selection processes may be a hopelessly inadequate framing of life's history on our planet. We might instead see evolution as the feeling forward of a distributed, collective consciousness, which is perennially drawn upwards towards new heights of novelty and complexity. Life might be better understood as a dreaming gardener rather than the blind watchmaker suggested by Richard Dawkins. Michael Levin's theoretical work and experimental research clearly illustrate the significance and implications of the morphogenetic field as a core model within developmental biology, and point us, I would argue, towards a truly morphogenetic rather than mechanistic paradigm of biological science. Before moving forward, however, I should also emphasize that the bioelectric fields, or gradients of electrical potential between cell membranes studied by Dr. Levin, are not necessarily identical with the concept of morphogenetic fields developed by Rupert Sheldrake within his theory of morphic resonance. It could be, perhaps, that bioelectric fields are a manifestation of a more general form of morphogenetic field which is not necessarily electrical in nature. These distributions of electrical potential could be downstream of more fundamental fields, and as we will see later on, this is what I expect to actually be the case. Such a distinction may be very significant because, as we shall see, Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance goes beyond the direct implications of Levin's own theoretical work in one very crucial manner. Morphic resonance conjectures that, at least at their most fundamental level, the morphogenetic fields which give shape to living systems are in fact non-local. That is to say that such morphogenetic fields are able to exert a formative influence upon one another in a manner that is largely, if not entirely, independent of space and time. This is, of course, a much more radical claim, at least when considered within the bounds of the mechanistic materialist paradigm, and with what follows, we will begin to see the reasoning and evidence which suggested to Rupert Sheldrake that this must, in fact, be the case. The most basic form of resonance within morphic resonance theory is self-resonance, by which an organism's morphic field is influenced by its own past states. Morphic resonance is theorized to operate on the basis of formal similarity, and, generally speaking, the processes which are going to be the most similar to an organism at any given moment will be its own past states. Morphic fields, due to such self-resonance, exhibit a kind of inertia, as a field attempts to maintain its own form over time. If we extend this notion of morphic fields beyond the bounds of physiological development and into the realm of psychology, then consideration of self-resonance could potentially help us to understand the nature of addiction, ritualistic behaviors, and many forms of neurodivergency among human beings, such as obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Yet, Sheldrake contends that the effects of morphic resonance extend far beyond the effects of an individual's own past upon its own subsequent states. Sheldrake argues that in order to fully understand the nature of living systems, we must also realize that the influence of morphic fields is able to occur between individual organisms, thereby resulting in a form of automatic averaging, by which self-organizing systems such as bodies, behavioral patterns, cognitive processes, and learning dispositions are able to inform one another in a horizontal as well as vertical manner. Sheldrake tells us that the term morphic resonance is intended to imply a form of sympathetic resonance, which parallels the phenomenon of energetic resonance. Energetic resonance is the process by which vibratory systems are able to transfer energy and information due to similarity of frequency. The sound waves produced by a tuning fork, for example, are able to induce vibrations within another tuning fork, given that there are sufficient harmonic relations between the two devices. Sympathetic resonance can be observed with various musical instruments such as guitars or harps. If, for example, a lower frequency string is played which shares an overtone with the fundamental frequency of a string which is tuned higher, then the higher pitched string will begin to vibrate and produce sound even though it is not itself being played. Some instrument designs take advantage of sympathetic resonance intentionally, while other instrument features are designed specifically to mitigate such resonance. A similar process is found in the functioning of radio receivers. Radio transmitters emit low-frequency electromagnetic waves within a certain bandwidth. A radio receiver, which is tuned to the correct bandwidth, will be sensitive to radio waves within the specified range and will respond to them, thereby receiving the information encoded within the radio waves. The radio receiver is then able to translate this encoded information into sound or visual images. Sheldrake suggests that morphic resonance may operate in a similar manner. While energetic resonance functions on the basis of similarity within a single dimension, that of frequency, morphic resonance operates on the basis of similarity within the multi-dimensional space of living forms. Morphogenetic patterns which are more similar to one another exert a kind of stabilizing or regulative influence upon one another, as similar living processes are more sensitive to or more tuned into one another. Much like waves of sound or electromagnetism, self-organizing systems are constantly in states of cyclical flux. The electron orbitals of atoms vibrate, oscillating in strength with a particular frequency, which directly correlates with the energy of the electrons. Living cells, tissues, and organs are constantly in a state of metabolic flux, repeating oscillatory patterns at various levels of organization. All organisms undergo cycles of birth, development, reproduction, senescence, and death. All living organisms are complex, nested, and interwoven patterns of such cyclic processes which coalesce so as to form organic wholes. Rather than acting by a transfer of energy, as in the case of sound resonance or electromagnetic resonance, morphic resonance would instead act by reducing indeterminacies in specific ways. Sheldrake asks us to think of morphic fields as structures or distributions of probability. At the most basic level of self-organizing systems, the level of fundamental particles, we find an inextricable indeterminacy. The behavior of fundamental particles is not fully predictable, and as such, the behavior of higher-order systems such as molecules, crystals, or cells cannot be perfectly determined either. Morphogenetic fields would then operate by conditioning the likelihood of certain events so as to give shape to developing organic systems. Morphic resonance would serve to carve out certain developmental pathways, or creodes, from distributions of possibility. Morphic resonance would thus operate by a kind of automatic averaging. Living processes which are very similar, which are in very close proximity within a given morphological space, will come to influence one another by giving shape to the space of possible permutations that are available to such processes. Like carving a statue from a slab of marble, this formative influence would come to direct the morphological development of living processes by reducing the likelihood of certain events and thereby prioritizing others. The morphic field of a presently unfolding animate process will be like a composite image which contains within it all of the animate processes which have already occurred, with the strength of such influences determined by how proximate such past processes are to a present process within morphological space. The primary reason which brought Rupert Sheldrake to begin developing the theory of morphic resonance was simply the inadequacy of mechanistic explanations to actually account for the biological phenomena which Sheldrake had attempted to study. Later on in this video, we will be looking with more detail at the relationship between the theory of morphic resonance and philosophical endeavors to move beyond the bounds of the mechanistic materialist paradigm. Moving forward, however, we will first look at some of the empirical findings, which Sheldrake puts forward as evidence of morphic resonance. In 1920, the British psychologist William McDougall conducted experiments of rat behavior at Harvard University with the intention of empirically testing the Lamarckian theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. McDougall's experiments involved a group of white rats, which were tasked with swimming through a tank of water and escaping the tank by one of two ramps. One ramp was brightly illuminated and thus easier for the animals to see, but this illuminated ramp would deliver an electric shock to the rats as they passed over it. The other ramp was unilluminated and thus less obvious to the animals, but passing through this exit would not deliver such a shock. The rats were required to swim through water to find the exits, as this would prevent the animals from using scent trails to find the routes that had already been taken by other rats in previous trials. Throughout numerous trials, McDougall's rats would eventually learn that they could only try to escape by the unilluminated exit. Although some rats would go through more than 300 trials before learning to avoid the illuminated exit, the animals would eventually learn to associate the bright illumination with the electric shock, and thus to look for a different way out of the tank. These rats would then be bred to produce a subsequent generation, which would likewise be subjected to the same tests. The breeding pairs which would produce the subsequent generation were selected before testing, so as to account for the possibility of unconscious bias on the part of the researchers, though breeding itself would be conducted after the testing of the animals. The goal here was to determine whether or not subsequent generations of the rats would learn to avoid the brightly illuminated exit ramp at a faster rate than their predecessors. These experiments would continue over the course of 15 years and 32 generations of rats. In addition to the primary group of rats, which were bred at random, McDougall would also conduct the same experiments upon two other groups of rats, one in which the fastest learning rats were selected for breeding, and one in which only the slowest learning rats were selected for breeding. If we presume that no inheritance of acquired learning should be at play, then we would expect that only the rats bred on the basis of faster learning should come to learn faster upon subsequent generations. The rats bred at random should come to learn at approximately the same speed from generation to generation, and the rats bred for slower learning should, if anything, come to learn more slowly on average than their predecessors. McDougall also occasionally tested a fourth group of rats whose parents had not undergone such experiments as yet another control group. What McDougall found was that all four groups of rats came to learn to avoid the illuminated exit at a markedly faster rate from generation to generation. These experiments were then repeated by the zoologist Wilfred Auger of Melbourne University. In addition to the controls which McDougall had implemented in his experiments, Auger also more systematically tested the learning of rats whose parents had not been trained in previous trials. This was to allow for more rigorous comparison of changes in learning speed between rats whose parents had previously undergone the experiments with rats whose parents had not undergone such trials. As with McDougall's experiments, Auger found that the rats of the trained breeding line came to learn faster upon subsequent generations, but also found a marked increase in learning speed for the untrained generations of rats as well. The rats whose parents had undergone the trials did indeed learn more quickly, as the Lamarckian theory would predict, but even the rats whose parents had never undergone the experiments at all somehow also learned faster. Although the results of these experiments seem to somehow be at odds with both Lamarckian and Neo-Darwinian models of inheritance, Sheldrake argues that these results align exactly with what would be predicted by the theory of morphic resonance. As the rats came to learn to associate the illuminated exit with the correlated electric shock, the developmental pathway towards learning this association was thereby reinforced with each subsequent generation, and the influence of this reinforcement was inherited by all of the rats which were studied, not only those whose parents had undergone the trials. Thus, the learning of this association came more easily, not only for the offspring of the rats which had already learned this association, but also for unrelated rats, as their learning processes came to be influenced by the previous generations as well, not through physical heredity, but due to the influence of morphic resonance. As the developmental pathway, or creode, came to be carved out, all of the rats which were adequately similar to the experimental subjects found it increasingly easier to learn the association between the illumination and the electric shock. Morphic resonance is a theory which pertains not only to biological organisms, but to all self-organizing or autopoietic systems in general. This implies that the effects of morphic resonance should be found not only in biological organisms, but also perhaps in molecular, atomic, or even astronomical structures. For any such systems, the form which is achieved by self-organization should be shaped by the morphic influence of similar systems which have developed in the past. for systems which have existed for vast amounts of time, such as hydrogen atoms, for example. The cumulative influence of the past should be so great that such systems exhibit very little morphogenetic variability. Novel developments should have very little effect, as any such alterations should exert invisibly minuscule influence in comparison to the effects of innumerable past instances. Very old morphological structures, in other words, should be far more stable and determinate than more novel structures. Conversely, the effects of morphic resonance should be much more pronounced and noticeable within systems which are relatively new. Synthetic structures, which have only ever been created by human artifice, therefore, should allow us to empirically observe and even measure the effects of morphic resonance. Morphic resonance should predict that synthetic chemical compounds which have never existed prior to their synthesis by human beings should initially be very difficult to create. Without the influence of past forms to guide the formation of the new substance, random chance will have a greater bearing upon the formation of the substance. Formation will be less likely to occur, and the system will break down more easily until the cumulative effects of past iterations come to stabilize the morphology of the novel chemical structure. We should expect new compounds to become more and more stable and more easily synthesized over time. Looking to the history of synthetic chemistry, Sheldrake argues that this is exactly what we find. Tyrannose, for example, is a type of sugar used as a carbon source by numerous species of bacteria and fungi, and which occurs naturally in honey. For many decades, tyrannose was considered to be a liquid, as it had only ever been observed in a liquid form. In the 1920s, however, tyrannose crystals were created for the first recorded time, and subsequently such crystallization came to be observed throughout the world. Today, tyrannose is regarded as a solid crystal substance with a melting point of 168 degrees Celsius. In some cases, new crystal structures come to emerge which seem to replace previous forms. Xylitol, a kind of artificial sweetener, was first created in 1891 and was initially considered to be a liquid. In 1942, a crystalline form of xylitol with a melting point of 61 degrees Celsius came to develop. A few years later, a new crystal structure came about, now with a melting point of 94 degrees Celsius, and thereafter, chemists found that they were unable to recreate the first crystal form, perhaps indicating that the second structure was more stable and thus was able to outcompete or overwrite the previous, less stable structure. Within the realm of synthetic chemistry and pharmaceutical manufacturing, the emergence or displacement of new forms is a well-documented and recurrent issue. The drug ritonavir, for example, was introduced in 1996 as a treatment for AIDS. After 18 months of continual manufacturing of the substance, chemical engineers came to discover a previously unknown polymorph of the compound, one which rendered the compound significantly less effective for treatment purposes. The chemists involved soon found that they were unable to prevent the new polymorph from forming, and the drug had to be withdrawn from distribution. It therefore seems that, in many cases, some polymorphs form more readily than their counterparts, and the former come to outcompete the latter. As many chemists have noted, once a new chemical polymorph emerges in one location, the novel form soon comes to emerge throughout the world. Regarding this often pernicious phenomenon, the American chemist Charles P. Saylor remarked that it was, quote, as though the seeds of crystallization had been carried upon the winds from end to end of the earth, end quote. It is true that molecular crystals can act as seeds of a sort, which are able to spark a chain reaction by which the crystal formation spreads throughout a given compound. Thus, in explaining the phenomenon of new structures seeming to emerge in disparate parts of the world at the same time, chemists have sometimes suggested that such seeds travel from laboratory to laboratory upon the clothes or beards of migrant scientists who contaminate the substances of different labs and thus spread the new polymorphs. Sheldrake, however, suggests that this phenomenon is the result of morphic resonance. Once new forms come to be achieved for a given molecular structure, the achievement of that form then becomes much more likely for all such molecular structures throughout the world. The developmental pathway of the novel form comes to condition the morphogenetic behaviors of such molecules, and such a pathway is, in a sense, made available across space and time. It is possible that careful experiments involving novel compounds could empirically substantiate Sheldrake's claim that such phenomena occur due to the effects of morphic resonance. If several new synthetic crystal forms were developed within roughly the same time frame, then experimenters could isolate one of the new forms and synthesize it repeatedly over a period of time, while not recreating the other forms. Then the experimenters could synthesize all of the forms involved and measure how readily the different forms come to crystallize and their melting points. If Sheldrake's theory is correct, we would expect the repeatedly synthesized form to then crystallize faster than the other forms and have a higher melting point than the other forms. Given that the theory of morphic resonance implies that novel chemical structures should become more stable over time, this suggests that we should see a substantial increase over time in the melting points of synthetic crystals that are relatively new, and we should likewise see that older synthetic compounds should have notably higher melting points than newer synthetic compounds. With data collected from various editions of chemist handbooks printed throughout the 20th century, Sheldrake shows that, in fact, there has been an often drastic increase in the measured melting points of relatively new synthetic crystal structures, while the melting points of naturally forming crystals has remained almost completely stable in most examples. This data is exactly what one would expect to be the case if morphic resonance were indeed at work in conditioning the behavior of these chemical compounds. Naturally forming crystals have existed for a long enough time that the cumulative effects of morphic resonance have stabilized their melting temperatures. With synthetic chemicals, conversely, we see the effects of morphic resonance accumulating throughout the years since their creation by human beings. As resonance further solidifies the morphic fields associated with these chemicals, their melting points should come to measurably increase. Some chemists have explained this phenomenon by indicating that these changes in the measurements of melting points could be instead due to improvements in the purity of these chemicals over time. Impurities in chemicals can in fact lower melting temperatures, though that explanation would not in itself account for the fact that such temperature change over time seems to have occurred primarily in synthetic chemicals, but not in naturally occurring chemicals. Improvements in purity might very well have also resulted in discrepancies over time in the measured melting points of naturally occurring chemicals as well, if the samples used were created by human manufacturing. Unfortunately, we simply don't have data on the purity of the samples which were used in the measurements of those melting points over the course of previous decades, and so we can't definitively decide the issue one way or another until further tests are conducted. Again, the creation of new synthetic chemicals could rule out the possibility of these increases being due to increases in purity. Researchers could measure the melting points over time while also testing for the purity of the samples used. If a noticeable increase is nevertheless detected over time, then there must be some other explanation. By looking more closely at the world of chemical structures, we can begin to see the broader implications of Sheldrake's theory, not only for biology and chemistry, but also for our presumptions about nature more generally. Chemicals are, of course, composed of atoms. Different species of atoms bond with one another in different ways, primarily due to the role of the electron orbital shells which encase them. Within covalent bonds, the orbital field of each atom becomes completed, as it were, by the electron of the other atom. Such covalent bonds are the most common type of bond found in most chemical compounds, and thus the primary means by which collections of individual atoms come together so as to form more complex molecular crystals such as proteins. The most typical presumption made by most scientists is that the formation of chemical compounds is determined entirely by unchanging laws, which dictate the behaviors of different types of atomic elements. If one understood fully the law-like constants which dictate the nature of the atoms, then one would have a full understanding of their bonding behavior, and one would therefore be able to predict the nature of the compounds formed by these atoms. Through extrapolating from an understanding of such laws, scientists should, at least in principle, be able to predict the melting points, structures, and behaviors of chemical compounds, even without the need to create and empirically study such compounds. In reality, however, making such predictions is usually not possible. Typically, scientists do in fact have to experiment and observe in order to determine the properties of chemical compounds. Their properties cannot actually be deduced in an a priori manner by inferring from physical constants. Nonetheless, the unspoken presumption generally remains unquestioned. The presumption that if these phenomena were not so complex, or if we had more detailed information about the laws which govern atomic bonding behaviors, then such predictions would actually be possible for all chemical structures. The shortcomings of this presumption can be seen quite dramatically within the science of protein synthesis. Scientists have grappled with the protein folding problem since the 1960s, when researchers began to inquire as to how exactly the amino acid sequences of proteins come to determine the complex three-dimensional structures of such protein molecules. Despite many decades of research, chemists remain unable to adequately explain how such three-dimensional structures are dictated by the behaviors and properties of the atoms which comprise them, or how protein folding is able to occur at the incredible speeds which are observed. Researchers have employed numerous computational methods in attempts to predict protein structures, though these methods have only ever achieved very limited success with very small, isolated proteins, and researchers have, as yet, been unable to generalize from these isolated accomplishments. In the year 2018, AlphaFold, an artificial intelligence system developed by Google DeepMind Laboratories, began to be employed by researchers in an attempt to predict protein structures. AlphaFold was a machine learning system which was trained by examining the known properties of over 170,000 proteins. AlphaFold was then used in an attempt to use this information to predict protein structures. Although AlphaFold did achieve a degree of success in making these predictions, which was much higher than what had previously been accomplished, the results it produced were far from perfect and not nearly accurate enough to allow for the discovery of new pharmaceutical compounds. More importantly, however, is that although AlphaFold was able to make somewhat accurate predictions of protein structures, it remains unclear as to how exactly AlphaFold was even able to accomplish this. If some hidden laws of nature are indeed fully determinative of protein structures, AlphaFold is still not able to actually tell us what those laws are. AlphaFold predicts the structures of proteins based on data pertaining to other proteins, and although it has achieved a relatively impressive degree of statistical accuracy in doing so, it still cannot tell us why or how proteins actually fold the way that they do. What the theory of morphic resonance suggests is that we are not able to predict the structures of proteins based on the properties of their constituent atoms because protein structures are not actually determined by law-like a priori constants of nature which dictate such bonding behaviors. The higher level structure simply cannot be fully understood as derivative of lower level constituents, as higher level structures are achieved in an evolutionary rather than a strictly mechanistic and reductionistic manner. The protein folding problem remains a problem, not because we do not yet have the computational power needed to account for the complexity which we are faced with, but rather because the protein folding problem itself is an ill-posed problem, one which is conditioned by presumptions about nature which are themselves fundamentally deficient. These presumptions are outgrowths of the more general, metaphysical paradigm of mechanistic reductionism, a framework which has largely, but never entirely, dominated scientific discourse and scientific practices since the achievements of Galileo and Descartes. While natural sciences study the actual phenomena which make up the natural world, metaphysical paradigms consist of the basic presumptions about the world, which are needed in order to contextualize and direct such study of nature. Observations and experiments must be interpreted within the context of scientific theories, and scientific theories are only comprehensible within the context of our presumptions about what the world fundamentally is. Without such presumptions, all empirical data would simply be noise, as we would find ourselves unable to interpret any empirical data in a meaningful or consequential manner. When we turn our critical scrutiny back towards those fundamental assumptions, we begin to enter the domain of metaphysics. As we do so, we can begin to see that metaphysical paradigms are not only grounded in core presumptions about the nature of the world, but even more fundamentally, such paradigms are grounded in core metaphors, core images which allow the world to be disclosed to us in a comprehensible manner. As we have discussed in more detail in previous videos, these core metaphors are fundamental structural features which condition the morphology of human practices and communication systems. The core metaphor is what bounds a given paradigm within horizons of intelligibility. The core metaphor of the mechanistic materialist paradigm is, of course, the machine. Within this horizon of meaning, the world is understood to consist of processes which are fundamentally mechanistic in nature. Understood through such a metaphorical scheme, the processes which comprise the world are therefore understood to be fundamentally inanimate, to be entirely dictated by invariant constants, and therefore to be entirely predictable, at least in principle. Insofar as fundamental indeterminacies, such as those of quantum mechanics, must be accounted for, they are typically regarded simply as randomness or noise, rather than as animate agency, or it is assumed that indeterminacies must somehow be illusory facades beneath which we will eventually find a fully deterministic universe. Such a paradigm is very useful for the development of machine technologies. Mechanical devices need to behave consistently in order to be reliable. As such, if one is attempting to develop machine technologies, it is perfectly reasonable to look to patterns in nature which seem to be law-like, consistent, and therefore predictable in deterministic and quantifiable ways. Due to the manner by which this mechanistic metaphor came to influence the development of science over the course of the past few centuries, the metaphor itself came to solidify, no longer understood as a metaphor, but rather as an obvious and even incontestable truth about the nature of reality. It shouldn't be surprising then that the apologists of mechanistic thinking would point to machines as a paradigmatic example of epistemological verification. We can see that this is what nature is actually like, so we are told, because the machines created through the use of this metaphor actually work. Indeed, practical application is a very important epistemological consideration with regards to any theory or any metaphysical system, but what we must consider here is how mechanistic thinking has conditioned us to regard machine technologies themselves as the epitome of practical application. The vast majority of human engagement with the world is organic, not technological, and we should be willing to consider how reasonable it really is to regard such technological engagement as epistemologically primary, over and above all of the other ways that we actually encounter the world and participate within the world. As Sheldrake indicates, the theory of morphic resonance is fundamentally a theory of formative rather than mechanistic causation, one in which patterns of self-organization are achieved through the creative advance of the natural world rather than being predetermined in advance by transcendental laws which are simply given. Sheldrake's theory thus finds itself so at odds with the prevailing paradigm of academic science in that it is representative of a kind of thinking which is process-relational and animistic rather than reductionistic and mechanistic. Yet, perhaps most fundamentally, the theory of morphic resonance contrasts with the mechanistic paradigm in that it transcends the implicit metaphysical dualism of mechanistic metaphors. The origins of mechanistic materialism can be found in the early 17th century, with the works of Galileo Galilei and René Descartes, both of whom contributed significantly to a form of thinking which would come to sharply divide the world into two distinct realms. On one side of this dualistic bifurcation was the realm of matter, of physical constants, of that which is publicly observable and which can be precisely measured through mathematics. On the other side was the realm of mind, of consciousness, of free will, and of God. The former realm came to be regarded as the realm of objective reality and thus the proper domain of scientific pursuits. Science was to concern itself with that which was precisely measurable and predictable, while the converse realm of the subjective, qualitative, and unpredictable would instead be the domain of the unscientific, of art, poetry, or theology. The objective world was said to consist of matter, and matter was considered to be that which existed independently of consciousness. Matter was thought to behave in strict accordance with entirely deterministic laws which were set in place by God, and thus matter was considered to be entirely devoid of freedom and subjectivity. Matter was also considered to be entirely reducible. That is to say that material things could, at least in principle, be understood entirely in terms of the functioning of their parts. The existence of material things was considered to be entirely conditioned by the nature of fundamental laws which acted specifically upon the smallest material constituents of the world. If one simply understood the ways in which the laws of nature dictated the behavior of the parts which made up a whole entity, then one would have an exhaustive understanding of the whole entity, as there would be nothing left over in need of being accounted for. This separation of mind and matter would result in very serious conceptual problems which would come to be grappled with over the course of subsequent centuries by thinkers such as John Locke, David Hume, and most significantly, Immanuel Kant. Although numerous philosophers and scientists would come to see this bifurcation of nature as incoherent and inadequate for actually accounting for the facts of the natural world, this dualistic paradigm would nevertheless go on to become ever more entrenched within scientific culture. As science and technology continued to develop throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many thinkers would increasingly attempt to transform this mind-matter dualism into a materialistic monism. Such thinkers would contend that the world was, in fact, only matter, and therefore that notions like consciousness, free will, or God would need to be either reduced to matter or would need to be discarded entirely. The clockmaker God and clockwork universe of the Enlightenment would, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, come to be replaced by a clockwork universe with no clockmaker. Conscious agency and freedom would be declared illusory by many scientists, and consciousness itself came to be seen as a kind of mirage, which could be reduced to the mechanical workings of blind, lifeless, and purposeless material interactions. Materialism and dualism appear at first to be fundamentally opposed systems of thought, with the latter understanding the world as consisting of two fundamental categories, mind and matter, and the former understanding the world as being composed of only matter. Nonetheless, materialist monism is necessarily built upon the dualist bifurcation of mind and matter. Materialism accepts the premise that matter itself is lifeless, purposeless, and devoid of agency and consciousness. Yet, whereas dualism relegates those properties to a second ontological register, materialism attempts to annihilate them entirely by demonstrating that animacy itself is a kind of illusion or facade which is built upon a substrate of purely mechanical lifelessness. Despite purporting to be a form of metaphysical monism, materialism is in reality a more extreme form of metaphysical dualism. Unlike the Neo-Darwinian understanding of life, which emerged from the paradigm of mechanistic materialism, the theory of morphic resonance is a theory which grew out from a very different way of conceptualizing nature, and thus we find this theory to be at odds with almost every fundamental presumption of the mechanistic paradigm. Morphic resonance is, as Sheldrake puts it, a theory of formative causation rather than reductionistic or mechanistic causation. As we have already seen, morphic resonance supposes that wholes cannot, in fact or in principle, be exhaustively reduced to their constituent parts. The theory instead presumes that self-organizing systems are able to direct their own structure in a way that cannot be entirely accounted for by the mechanistic behavior of constituent elements. There is immense indeterminacy in such patterns of self-organization, and the notion of formative causation implies that organic wholes, such as living bodies, patterns of behavior, or forms of cognition, can in fact direct their own development by constraining such indeterminacy in purposive ways. We can see this contrast within arguments pertaining to the nature of free will. It is common for many materialistic scientists and philosophers to argue that free will is a kind of illusion, that your behaviors are all determined by events which are not you, and therefore that you never truly choose to do anything. Your behavior is dictated by events which are happening in your brain, and these events are reducible to the behavior of the neurons, neurotransmitters, and hormones which make up your brain. Your neurons, in this view at least, do not choose to do anything that they do. Their behavior is mechanistically determined by the interactions of proteins, atoms, and electrons. If those parts determine your behavior and the parts themselves do not have free will, then it follows that you do not have free will either, and your sense of freedom then would seem to be a kind of cognitive illusion. Your consciousness does not really have any causal power, so we are told, because your consciousness is really just watching the behaviors which you are being blindly compelled to do by the parts which make you up. Mere randomness doesn't afford free will any elbow room either. If our actions are partially dictated by randomized quantum dice rolls, we do not therefore become any more free. Rolling a quantum die and allowing its results to determine your actions does not make your actions any more or less self-determined than if they were fully determined by external forces. That which is dictating your behavior is simply indeterminate rather than determinate, as there is no room in such a worldview for self-determination. Yet, if we conceptualize free will in terms of formative causation, we can see that free will is not a matter of determinism and randomness, but rather a matter of parts and wholes. That is, a matter of reductionism or holism. If parts completely determine the behavior of wholes, then there is no room for free will. But if we are able to see that wholes can and do dictate the behavior of their parts, then we can account for free will in an entirely consistent and naturalistic manner. The behavior of individual neurons does not and cannot actually account for the behavior of the whole brain, as the higher level organizational structures coordinate the lower level constituent neurons which comprise the whole. Particular structures within the brain, and even individual neurons, are in fact self-directed by a kind of nested cognitive agency which interweaves the various organizational layers of the living system into a complex whole that is in fact self-determining. Yet Sheldrake also implies that such self-determination of self-organization is not limited to humans, to brains, or even to biological creatures, but rather that such phenomena are to be found at all levels of nature. As we have already seen, such formative causation may be at work in the behavior of molecular structures and even the structure of individual atoms and fundamental particles. This would then potentially imply that at least some degree of agency and subjectivity should be present throughout nature, even down to the most fundamental constituents of the world itself. Viewed through the framework of mechanistic materialism, this would appear to be an absurdly outlandish claim. Reductionist thinkers are often reluctant to regard even human beings as free in any meaningful sense, and thus the suggestion that forms of conscious agency might be fundamental properties of individual cells, molecules, atoms, or photons would seem to be patently absurd. Mechanistic materialism is grounded in the presumption that the fundamental constituents of reality are purely objective, entirely devoid of subjectivity and thus devoid of agency. Through other paradigms, however, such a possibility may seem not only plausible, but may be a conclusion that we necessarily arrive upon through our understanding of consciousness and reality. In order to adequately contextualize the theory of morphic resonance, we will next be looking at an alternative to mechanistic materialism, to the field of metaphysics known as process philosophy. Moving forward, we will be looking at two of the most significant thinkers within the realm of process philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead and Henri Bergson, and looking specifically at how the theory of morphic resonance can be contextualized within the framework of process metaphysics. In the earlier decades of his career, Alfred North Whitehead concerned himself mostly upon the development of mathematical logic. But throughout the 1910s and 1920s, Whitehead would increasingly come to focus upon philosophy of science and eventually the development of a metaphysical system which would ultimately culminate in the publication of Process and Reality, one of the most foundational and influential works within the field of process philosophy. Within Process and Reality, Whitehead would develop a rigorous conceptual framework which would radically diverge from the basic assumptions of mechanistic reductionism. Whitehead believed that such a reimagining of nature had become necessary, as materialistic metaphysics had proven itself unable to account for the world which had been revealed by science over the course of the preceding centuries. Unable to account for the nature of life, and unable to account for the reality of subjective experience itself. Whitehead would come to conceptualize the world as consisting of self-generative events, rather than of matter as we might commonly understand that term. Whitehead would dub these fundamental events or processes as actual entities, or occasions of experience, which come to form through a process which he would term concrescence. Concrescence can be understood as the means by which distributions of possibility come to coalesce within events which Whitehead described as droplets of awareness. These droplets of electromagnetic experience then come to comprise the past and thus to comprise the physical dimension of the natural world. In polar contrast with actualities are then potentialities, or what Whitehead would refer to as eternal objects, the basic elements of form, such as mathematical objects, which come together so as to give shape to the world. Eternal objects, much like Platonic forms, are patterns in themselves, independently of whatever actualities they might come to give shape to. As the process of concrescence is a process of becoming concrete, eternal objects are that which conditions the definiteness of particular actualities. Whitehead refers to his conceptual scheme as a philosophy of organism, in that the fundamental processes which make up the world are seen to be inherently organic in nature. Thus, the natural world can be seen as being comprised of processes which are inextricably experiential, with each fundamental unit of actuality consisting of both a subjective as well as an objective dimension. For Whitehead, the term organism refers not only to biological life forms, but to any beings which are holistic, self-generative processes. This would include not only biological cells, but also molecules, atoms, and even celestial entities such as stars, solar systems, and galaxies. Within Process and Reality, Whitehead tells us that the objectivity of the world consists in the manner by which processes come to concretize, and thus to become past actualities, which are then made available to contribute themselves to the continual creative advance of the world. The past thus serves as a ground out of which the present is continually able to grow. When we empirically experience the physicality of the world, the past actualities which have come to achieve definiteness through their concrescences are contributing themselves into our own processes of experience, our own processes of self-generation. Conversely, we then have the subjective dimension of the world, in which fundamental moments of experience actually determine, through their own agency, the potentialities which will give shape to the developing events themselves. Each organic event can be seen as collapsing a space of potentialities into a concretely defined moment, which is then incorporated into the manifold of the past. Every moment of subjective experience is thus a moment of decision, in which an organic process determines for itself what possibilities come to define its developing actuality. Through this conceptual lens, we see that the world is not simply indeterministic in the sense that it is determined by random rolls of quantum dice. Rather, the indeterminacy of the world is actually self-determinacy. The fundamental processes which constitute the world come to be completed, as it were, through the conscious decisions through which indeterminate distributions of potentiality become concretely defined actualities. Seen through Process and Reality, our world is not simply an amalgamation of blind, inert mechanisms. Rather, it is a world which is fundamentally alive, a world of animacy in which the future is genuinely open, and a world in which celestial, biological, and human evolutions are seen to be the creative achievements of a cosmic purposiveness. Returning now to Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, we can see just such an organismic view of nature at work, and one which parallels Whitehead's metaphysical framework in numerous ways. Morphogenetic fields are spaces of potentiality which organic systems navigate throughout their development. animacy is not something which arises as an epiphenomenon from a substrate of inert, vacuous matter, but rather animacy is found within the most basic elements of the world. As these basic elements come to symbiotically converge so as to give rise to more complex wholes, the cosmos and the organisms which comprise it come to co-participate in the generation of ever more intricately harmonious forms of animacy. Morphic fields organize themselves into nested hierarchies, such that more basic forms of agency and experience come to form the immensely complex structures of cognition and freedom which we see within more complex life forms such as ourselves. Within Whitehead's organismic cosmology, organic systems are continually navigating through what we could call phase spaces of real potentialities which are available to them. Within the process of concrescence, these distributions of potentiality are subjectively experienced. Experiences which Whitehead refers to as mental feelings or conceptual prehensions. What I would like to suggest here is that these feelings of possibility spaces are in fact the morphic fields which we see within Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. This implies that morphic fields are what Whitehead would refer to as the mental poles of organic processes, and this is why, much earlier in this discussion, I suggested that the bioelectrical gradients found in living organisms must be downstream of even more fundamental fields. As we shall see moving forward, this also implies that influences between morphic fields need not be dependent upon spatial or temporal proximity in the same manner as physical influences. Whitehead describes the physical influences of the past as physical prehensions or physical feelings. Conversely, he uses the term conceptual prehension or mental feelings to describe the relationship between a process and the possibilities which are available to it. Through physical prehension, the concretized or corporeal aspects of the past come to be inherited into the composition of novel events. The determinations achieved by the past come to be incorporated into the structure of subsequent events, and it is this process which we commonly understand as physical, material, or efficient causation. As such, we can then understand that the spatial and temporal structure of nature itself is a kind of hierarchical organizational structure, which conditions the manner by which past actualities are able to contribute themselves to subsequent events. Past events, which are closer in either time or space to novel events, have greater priority in contributing themselves to those novel events. Past events which are further away in time or space have lower priority in such contribution. Although this is a subject which would take us a bit too far off course, I'd also like to parenthetically suggest that this manner of understanding space and time might cast new light on the astrophysical claim that our universe seems to be expanding. It seems that within this conceptual framework, the receding of past events into the deeper past is fundamentally no different than their becoming further away in space. But Whitehead tells us that just as a process can be influenced by the physical determinations of a past event, so too can a novel process be influenced by the mental dimension of a past event. That is to say that the morphic field of organic processes in the past can contribute to shaping the morphic fields of subsequent organic processes. Whitehead dubs this sort of influence hybrid prehension, in which the space of possibilities felt by an organic process in the past contributes itself to the shaping of the possibilities felt by a novel event. Such influence would thus be the kind of automatic averaging which Sheldrake describes in his theory of morphic resonance. The following quote is drawn from Whitehead's Process and Reality, and here we see Whitehead directly address this topic and its implications. Quote, "A pure physical prehension is the transmission of physical feelings, while hybrid prehension is the transmission of mental feelings. There is no reason to assimilate the conditions for hybrid prehensions to those for pure physical prehensions. Indeed, the contrary hypothesis is the more natural. For the conceptual pole does not share in the coordinate divisibility of the physical pole. Thus, the doctrine of immediate objectification for the mental poles and of mediate objectification for the physical poles seems most consonant to the philosophy of organism. This conclusion has some empirical support, both from the evidence for peculiar instances of telepathy and from the instinctive apprehension of a tone of feeling in ordinary social intercourse." End quote. So what Whitehead is saying here is that spatial extension, what he is calling coordinate divisibility, is relevant to the organization of physical influences, but that we have no reason to think that this organizational principle should also apply to the relationships between mental poles, the feelings of potentialities, which I am here identifying with what Sheldrake calls morphic fields. Thus, we should expect that the influences between morphic fields should occur in an immediate manner, as they needn't be mediated by relations of spatial extension. In other words, hybrid prehensions, or rather morphic resonance, should occur in a sort of telepathic manner. The morphic space, which was navigated by an organic process, may give shape to the spaces of possibility available to similar processes without the need for physical interaction or physical proximity. Rather, as Sheldrake indicates, such fields of possibility influence one another on the basis of how similar they are to one another. That is, their proximity within morphological space, rather than on the basis of their proximity within physical space. Thus, if we look at the theory of morphic resonance through Whitehead's process-relational framework, rather than through the framework of mechanistic materialism, we see that such a phenomenon isn't particularly radical at all, but rather is a natural extension of what we would expect from an organic, self-organizing world. There is no need for some sort of extra medium to be at work here. We needn't necessarily hypothesize any exotic particles or other such mediating entities in order to account for such a phenomenon, as we can see that the immediacy of mental relationships is just as natural as the spatial mediation of physical relationships. This immediacy of mental relationships then implies that the past is never destroyed or lost. Rather, the events which comprise the past are able to continually contribute themselves to shaping the creative advance of nature. Past events are not simply dead, but are rather immortalized, as they are incorporated into a past which remains very much alive. This notion of the presencing of the past then brings us to Henri Bergson, a process philosopher whose thought directly contributed to the development of Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. In examining the correspondences between Sheldrake and Bergson, we will now begin to look more closely at the phenomenon of memory, and the roles played by memory within the frameworks developed by these two thinkers. First, however, I want us to look at attempts to understand memory within the framework of academic materialism. As seen through the lens of mechanistic materialism, memory seems as though it should be a fairly straightforward matter, especially given the significant achievements in computational information storage and retrieval which have developed over the course of the past several decades. We might reasonably assume that the memories of living organisms are fundamentally the same as computer memories. Information becomes encoded, presumably, within the physical structure of the brain, and later on these structures of information can somehow be reactivated or retrieved in much the same way that a computer system is able to retrieve the information which is encoded in its physical hardware. Looking at the actual science of memory, however, what we seem to find is something which simply does not accord with such expectations. During the early decades of the 20th century, the American psychologist Carl Lashley theorized that memories should be stored within the brain as structures of information which he referred to as engrams, and which he suspected would be located within different regions of the cerebral cortex. In the 1920s, Lashley would conduct experiments upon rats in an effort to actually locate where specific memories are stored within the brain. Within these experiments, Lashley would have his rats learn how to run a particular maze, and then would create lesions within the rats' brains in particular areas. Lashley hoped that through these experiments, he would be able to identify where certain memories were stored, as the lesions he created would be seen to erase the memories which had been stored in those areas of the rats' brains. Despite substantial efforts, Lashley found himself unable to destroy the memories which the rats had formed. No matter what regions of the cerebral cortex were damaged, his rats were able to retain their memory of how to run the maze regardless. Lashley would therefore come to conclude that memories must somehow be distributed throughout the brain rather than being stored in particular locations. Although memory science has since developed a better understanding of how certain brain regions play distinct roles in piecing together the information within memories, such as the role of the hippocampus in processing information pertaining to where and when certain memories were formed, we have as yet been unable to actually determine where or how any specific memories are actually stored in the brain. We still cannot say where memories actually are, and therefore, I would argue, it remains an unsubstantiated assumption that memories are in fact stored within the brain at all. Another particularly unusual phenomenon is that of memories being apparently transferred via organ transplants. Although certainly bizarre, this is now a fairly well-documented phenomenon within medical literature, as is the potentially related phenomenon of personality changes which occur following such organ transplants. Attempts to explain this phenomenon often make reference to the fact that neurons are found throughout various organs of the human body, but it seems unlikely that these bodily neurons could contain complex memories or personality traits given their relatively low density compared with the brain. The human heart, for example, contains some 40,000 neurons, which would not seem to be enough to allow for the formation, retention, and retrieval of specific memories or nuanced personality traits. The human digestive system, by comparison, is estimated to contain between 100 million and 500 million neurons, while we find within the human brain some 86 billion neurons. If memories are indeed distributed throughout the brain, then why would an organ such as the heart contain a complete copy of such a distributed memory? Storing the memory in more than one location would not seem to provide much benefit to retention and retrieval, even if the relatively minimal number of neurons found within organs such as the heart are sufficient to actually accomplish such functions. The notion of cellular memory is sometimes vaguely invoked in order to explain these phenomena, but such invocations seem to go far beyond what cellular memory is known to be actually capable of. Individual somatic cells can indeed retain memories of events which occur at the cellular level, but there is no evidence that an individual somatic cell, or even collections of somatic cells, are able to store complex memories pertaining to the whole organism. The individual cells which make me up have no idea what sorts of specific events I have experienced. Likewise, individual cells within my body are dying and being born constantly, yet I do not have any memories of these events which occur at a cellular level. The memories of the parts are not necessarily the same as the memories of the whole. Yet these bizarre phenomena may seem much less strange if we conclude that memories are actually not stored within the brain, or the heart, or digestive system for that matter. Within his text Matter and Memory, Henri Bergson develops a manner of thinking about the relationships of mind and matter, or spirit and body, which focuses heavily upon the role of the past and of memory. For Bergson, mind or spirit can be understood as a kind of intensity, which corresponds to the degree to which the past comes to involve itself in the present. When we act only within the confines of the present moment, we act in a way that is more mechanical or habitual. We do not suspend action so as to take into account the past. When we act more consciously, however, we forestall action so as to involve prior thoughts or experiences through what Bergson calls image remembrance. Much like the ontology of event and experience developed by Whitehead, Bergson's ontology of images is one in which consciousness is found to be implicit within the very notions of objectivity and matter themselves. Materialist ontologies typically regard conscious experience as consisting of representations, depictions behind which it is assumed that there resides matter itself, which is understood to be something entirely independent of consciousness. Instead, Bergson reconceptualizes matter as being itself fundamentally experiential in nature. Bergson's images, much like Whitehead's droplets of experience, are physical or material insofar as they consist of the potential or virtual power to contribute themselves to novel moments of experience. While a representation is implied to be a kind of superficial facade which is exterior to a more fundamental but ultimately unknowable core of purely objective matter, images are for Bergson that which comprises both matter itself as well as the content of our experiences. This reintegration of subjectivity and objectivity, of mind and matter, is central to the projects of both Whitehead and Bergson and to the project of process philosophy more generally. For Bergson, memory is not a specialized function performed by biological nervous systems in a quasi-mechanical manner, but rather memory is a fundamental aspect of nature itself. Memory is the means through which the past is able to participate within the ever-ongoing self-generation of our reality, and one of the most significant roles performed by consciousness is in reaching into the depths of the past so as to bring the past into co-participation with the present. Bergson's emphasis upon memory and habit would be of central influence in the development of Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. Sheldrake argues that memory is not a matter of representations stored within the neurophysiological structures of the brain, but rather that memory is the presence of the past. Understood through such a process philosophical scheme, memories can be understood as existing within the world itself, rather than within physical brains. Such memories are able to be recreated by the brain insofar as the brain is able to repeat its past processes through morphic resonance. So now let us imagine exactly how the process of recollection might be understood within such a framework. In order for an organism to recall a specific memory of an experience, the mind of the organism must attempt to recreate the patterns of activity which it underwent during the initial experience. This recollection could initially be triggered by a similar experience, or simply a thought, or simply the desire to recall a specific memory. In any of these cases, a mental pattern would come to develop, which would closely resemble the mental patterns which occurred during the initial experience itself, which the organism is attempting to recall. These first few steps of mental activity would serve as what Sheldrake would call a morphic germ. For Sheldrake, a morphic germ is a kind of embryonic state of a self-organizing process, upon which morphic resonance can begin to act. The similarity between the morphic germ and similar organic developments which have occurred in the past then allow morphic resonance to guide the further development of the system through automatic averaging. As the first few developmental steps taken are identical or very similar, the process will then be guided by morphic resonance through the pathway of development in such a way that the process comes to repeat the patterns of the initial experience. The memory is not stored and then retrieved, but rather simply exists within the past in such a manner that the brain is able to tune into the previous experience and thus recreate the experience. This process of recollection would be far from perfect, however. If there are multiple memories which are very similar, then it may be that the process of recollection might be pulled by the influence of more than one similar experience within the past. If you take a moment to think about your own memory, I think you will find exactly what Sheldrake's hypothesis would imply. Our difficulties with memory tend to arise when we have numerous experiences which are so similar that we have difficulty determining which details belong to which events. Though it is almost needless to say, memories which are stored within computer systems do not work in this way at all. Computer memories can become corrupted or erased, but we would not expect any of these curious details of the phenomenon of recollection if the brain stored memories in a way which was analogous to computer memory. Understood within the context of morphic resonance, however, these are exactly the kinds of problems we would expect to have with our process of recollection. So could this conception of memory then also help us to explain how memories, or even personality traits, might be seemingly transferred through transplanted organs? As previously mentioned, organs such as the heart do contain neurons, perhaps not enough to contain detailed and specific memories, but perhaps more than enough to contain the embryonic germs of specific memories. The neurons within a transplanted heart then might be able to prompt within the recipient's brain a pattern of complex neural activity associated with a specific experience undergone by the heart's donor. As this initial pattern of activity then becomes directed by the previous experience, the organ recipient then comes to recall the memory in detail, almost as though he or she had experienced the event themselves. The memory itself then needn't be contained within the heart, nor anywhere else within the brain or body. Rather, what is needed is only the capacity for invoking the seeds of the memory, as the memory itself is simply contained in the past. Likewise, looking back to Lashley's experiments upon memories within rats, we again see exactly what we would expect if memory were indeed a process of resonance rather than physical storage. Destroying parts of the rat's brains does not destroy their memories, as the memories themselves simply are not contained within their brains. Given that a rat's brain remains able to re-instantiate the experiences, the rat will retain access to that memory. Now, with such a conception of mind and memory at hand, we will begin looking at how these ideas might allow us to understand the world of parapsychological research. According to Sheldrake, parapsychological phenomena such as telepathy and even out-of-body experiences should be a completely natural feature of a world which is characterized by the processes of morphic resonance. If a mind can be influenced by its own previous processes, it may likewise be possible for a mind to be influenced by processes which have occurred within other minds as well, in much the same manner as we saw previously regarding the intergenerational development of learning dispositions in rats. Sheldrake believes that such phenomena are not only possible but in fact extremely common, although oftentimes very subtle under ordinary circumstances. There is an enormous body of experimental research pertaining to psi or psychic phenomena. As with every field of science, there are some examples of psi research which seem very rigorous and compelling, while some attempts at such research seem much more dubious. This is a huge topic and realm of debate, and there's certainly no way that I can cover this topic exhaustively in this video, but I will point to some specific lines of research which seem to me the most compelling and most relevant to the theory of morphic resonance. Yet before delving into this, I'm going to have to get a bit polemical for a moment, as I'm sure that we are going to see some very predictable things happen in the comments section of this video, and I would like to attempt to address some of those things in advance. Parapsychology is a controversial topic. This is a topic upon which reasonable people might disagree. There are inevitably going to be many people who reject psi research out of hand simply because it is so at odds with the prevailing paradigm of modern science. This doesn't necessarily imply that such individuals are prejudiced or ignorant. It is a feature, not a bug of epistemology, that human beings tend to be skeptical of claims which do not square with their understanding of how the universe works at the most general level. It is perfectly natural and oftentimes perfectly reasonable that we should look for explanations that accord with the epistemological horizons which we operate within. With that said, there are several individuals, such as Michael Shermer, James Randi, and Susan Blackmore, who have essentially built their entire careers upon the claim that parapsychologists are all a bunch of quacks or charlatans who don't understand how science works. These so-called skeptics and the people who cite them tend to employ tactics which are, in my opinion, very dishonest, to put it mildly. Self-described skeptics tend to have absolutely no reservations about hurling ad hominem ridicule at those who they regard as their enemies, and these skeptics, at least when they are being most honest, are very clear that their own methodology involves making assumptions about what cannot be the case and then forming arguments for the sole purpose of dismissing any evidence that those assumptions might be incorrect. If you're interested in a deeper dive into the history and controversies of psi research and anti-psi public relations campaigns, then I'd highly recommend the book Science and Psychic Phenomena by the philosopher Chris Carter, link in the description. I myself was once of the persuasion that psi phenomena could not be real. I read Shermer, Blackmore, and Randi's books, and I was confident that there simply were no real psi phenomena because I only ever encountered psi research through the lens which those skeptics provided. It was very easy for me to be dismissive of such ideas, even though I knew essentially nothing about actual psi research, because that attitude of dismissal is exactly what those professional skeptics strive to instill within their readers. Eventually, I changed my mind, not because of an experimental bombshell that I could not dismiss, but rather because my philosophical conceptions about nature itself came to evolve over time. Once I came to the conclusion that psi phenomena might be at least possible, then I took the time to actually look into psi research itself, and ultimately I concluded that certain kinds of psi phenomena are almost certainly quite real. I do not believe that every self-proclaimed medium or psychic is in possession of special powers. Some people really are charlatans, and we should be mindful of that, but it is now my opinion that extrasensory influences between minds, human or otherwise, may actually be a rather common occurrence, which essentially operates on the same basis as everyday recollection. Among those who have taken psi phenomena seriously are numerous intellectual figures such as William James, Alfred North Whitehead, Jean Gebser, Henri Bergson, and of course Rupert Sheldrake, among many others. Despite what professional skeptics would have us believe, it is simply not the case that only the gullible and uninformed are willing to take parapsychology seriously, and in fact, the stigma which is associated with parapsychology is itself a very recent trend which has come to develop over the course of the past half-century. The universe is a very strange place, and when nature fails to conform to our ideas of what a rational world should look like, then it is our presuppositions about rationality which must be called into question. So now let us look at some of the scientific experiments which have been conducted by Sheldrake himself and others, which may be indicative of extrasensory influences between minds. Then we will look at how we might explain such phenomena in light of morphic resonance theory. Links to more detailed overviews of these experiments will be found in the description box below, and I very much encourage you to take a look at the original research, as I think the finer details of these experiments show them to be even more compelling. One type of research that Sheldrake has conducted pertains to the seeming tendency for individuals to intuitively sense phone calls before they occur. It's extremely common for people to feel that they think about a person close to them just before that person calls them. When hearing the phone ring, individuals sometimes report that they accurately sense who is calling them before they actually look at their phones. Sheldrake has taken anecdotes such as these as being a clue which could be indicative of extrasensory phenomena related to morphic resonance, and he has developed experiments in an effort to determine whether such intuitions do actually seem to indicate extrasensory perceptions. Within these telephone telepathy experiments conducted in the early 2000s, Sheldrake's team began by recruiting participants who were then instructed to nominate 4 potential callers who they personally knew. Experimenters would randomly determine which of the 4 callers would be calling the test subject, and then the experimenters would inform the nominee that they would be the one making the call. The experimenters would also then call the other nominees to let them know that they had not been selected to participate. Shortly before the phone call was to be made by the nominee, the experimenters would call the recipient and ask them to guess which of the 4 nominees would be calling them. This guess would be noted, and shortly thereafter, the selected nominee would call the recipient. The first round of tests involved 17 subject recipients and conducted 198 trials in total. In a second series of trials, Sheldrake and his team began using fixed times for the calls rather than randomly selecting the call times. These methods were used for a total of 87 trials. In a third series of trials, the research team streamlined the process such that the selected callers would know that they had been selected 15 minutes in advance of the call. Nominees who had not been selected would be informed that they would not participate by 5 minutes advance of the call. Using these methods, the researchers involved 34 participants over the course of 268 trials. Sheldrake hypothesized that since the call recipient subjects likely knew all of their nominees personally, it would thus be likely that certain patterns of activity within the call recipients' minds might respond to similar patterns which could occur within the minds of the selected callers when the callers experienced the intention to make the call. Thus, it might be possible that a recipient might sense this unconscious activity in such a manner as to intuitively determine which nominee would actually be calling them. There would be a sort of cognitive synchronization which might be activated by the intent to make the call. Human beings are, of course, inextricably social creatures, and if such synchronizations are indeed possible due to the effects of morphic resonance, then it seems likely that evolution would give rise to processes by which such interactions could occur, as such synchronizations could be very helpful for survival in numerous ways if such connections could come to link different members of families or social groups. If the guesses made by the recipients were due to random chance, then we would expect them to guess correctly about 25% of the time on average. During the first 30 trials, Sheldrake's team found that the guesses made by the recipients were correct 43% of the time. In the next series of 146 trials, the participants guessed correctly in 40% of the trials. This result was extremely significant statistically, yielding a p-value of 0.00003, one which is many times lower and thus more statistically significant than the common standard p-value of 0.05, above which results are considered to be statistically insignificant. A p-value of 0.05 indicates a 5% probability that the results could have came about by purely random chance, while the p-value of 0.00003 is a 0.003% chance, or a likelihood of 3 in 100,000. In the next series of 232 trials, the guesses of the participants were correct 98 times, or in 42% of the trials. The p-value of this series was 7 by 10 to the negative 9, a value of extremely high statistical significance. These trials also distinguished between results obtained in which the caller was familiar with the recipient and in which the caller did not personally know the recipient. In trials involving a caller who knew the recipients were correct 54% of the time, while in trials involving a caller who was a stranger, the recipients were correct 24% of the time. These results accorded with Sheldrake's prediction that the more familiar callers would yield greater results, as the connections between the minds of the callers and the recipients would be more developed. Whatever the explanation might be for these phenomena, random chance would be an absurdly improbable explanation, and an alternative explanation would need to account for why the recipient's guesses were so much more accurate when they knew the person who was about to call them. Sheldrake also took note of how many people's pets, particularly dogs, seem to be waiting for them when they come home from a period of absence. Dogs will often sit at a window or the front door and patiently wait for their owners to return. This is a phenomenon which could potentially be explained by numerous mundane factors. The dog might be familiar with what times the owner tends to return, or they might infer that the owner is returning based on the sound of the owner's car or the owner's scent. Nevertheless, Sheldrake suspected that this behavior might very well prove to be another example of synchronization between minds which occurred due to morphic resonance, and thus sought to construct experiments in which this possibility could be tested. Within these experiments, Sheldrake set up cameras which could record the times which dogs spent near the front windows where they tended to await their owner's return. Subjects would drive cars other than their own and return home at random times as directed by a telephone pager. After being paged, the subjects would allow a 10-minute pre-return period to elapse before beginning the return home. The video footage recorded would then be analyzed by a person who was not aware of when the subjects had been paged to return home or any other details of the experiment. The analyst would take note of the time spent by the dog at the window, and these results would then be compared with the absence, pre-return, and return periods. What this research discovered was that the tested dog spent much more time at the window anticipating the owner's return during the pre-return and return periods than the main periods of absence. Following the paging of the subject, the dogs would begin spending significantly more time waiting at the window than before the page, even if the dog's owner remained several kilometers away. One remaining possibility was that the dogs were much more likely to spend time at the window during the pre-return and return periods, simply because the dogs understood that the owner would be more likely to come home as more time elapsed. In order to test for this, the researchers also recorded the dog's behavior in trials within which the owner did not come home at all. If the dogs were simply being statistically predictive of their owner's behaviors, then we would expect to see the dog spend much more time at the window over the course of the day as their anticipation of the return increased, even though the owner would not in fact be returning that day. The results instead showed that the dog's behavior remained consistent throughout the entire course of the experiments. The dogs would occasionally go near the window for one reason or another, but this behavior was distributed evenly throughout the entire course of the experiment. Beyond Sheldrake's own research, there is also an extensive body of parapsychological experimentation which has been conducted over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, which seems to corroborate the predictions made by Sheldrake's conjectures. Although positive results often appear to be small, these experiments nevertheless repeatedly demonstrate statistical values which are far beyond the scope of what can be dismissed as random flukes or by the alleged file drawer effect. These experiments seem to indicate, among other things, that the minds of human beings are indeed capable of tuning into one another without direct sensory interactions. One type of experiment involves recruiting pairs of subjects who have personal connections with one another. The individuals of each pair are separated, and their brain activity is then measured using electroencephalography. One subject of the pair is designated as the sender and the other as the receiver. The sender is then randomly exposed to certain stimuli, such as flashing images on a television screen, and experimenters then go on to compare the EEG data to determine whether statistically significant correlations seem to have occurred between the two subjects. Numerous variations of this experiment have been conducted, some, for example, involving isolating the subjects within electromagnetically shielded rooms. Nevertheless, results appear to show a very consistent pattern. For most pairs of subjects, correlations between EEG readings appear to be statistically unimpressive. Yet, for certain pairs of subjects, correlations are consistently above what would be expected by random chance. In an iteration of this experiment conducted by Dr. Dean Radin and published in 2004, researchers found that 3 of 13 tested pairs demonstrated independently significant correlations, and also found that stronger EEG responses in stimulated subjects correlated with stronger synchronized responses in their non-stimulated correlates. Overall, the experiment yielded a p-value of 0.0005 compared to a control group p-value of 0.61. In another such series of experiments, also conducted in 2004, another team of researchers similarly found that 5 out of 60 experimental receivers demonstrated highly significant correlations to the stimuli responses recorded in their sender counterparts. As with Dr. Radin's experiments, the correlations found were far beyond what could be explained by random chance. Results also remained statistically insignificant during periods in which the sender was not exposed to visual stimuli, thus precluding the possibility that the pairs in question simply had very similar brainwave activity by default. For the pairs which showed correlations with a p-value of less than 0.01, the average p-value came to be 0.005, far beyond the realm of mere chance. Comparable results have been consistently observed experimentally throughout numerous studies over the course of several decades, with research findings consistently indicating a form of non-local interaction or synchronization between human minds. In 2018, a study by Professor Edsel Cardena was published by the journal American Psychologist, in which over 750 discrete studies of parapsychological phenomena were analyzed. The article concluded that evidence in favor of psi was, quote, comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. That is to say that we have as much experimental evidence to back up the reality of psi phenomena as we have to back up most of the claims which are generally accepted within established academic culture. There is a vast body of experimental research which purports to demonstrate evidence for extrasensory interaction between human minds, and adequately addressing the relevant literature, rebuttals, and counter-rebuttals would be a massive project in and of itself. Yet here I intend primarily to refer to this data as potential evidence for morphic resonance. One very common and dubious criticism of psi research is that it lacks an explanatory mechanism. This criticism essentially amounts to saying that because we don't know how psi phenomena could be possible, psi phenomena must therefore not be possible, even if experimental evidence indicates otherwise. In reality, there are several proposed explanatory mechanisms for such psi phenomena, but morphic resonance is a cohesive theory with implications which extend far beyond the bounds of human psychology, and thus it is a theory which can be corroborated by other types of experiments and observations, some of which we have already examined. With morphic resonance, we have an explanation which seems not only able to account for most psi phenomena in general, but which is also able to explain many of the specific nuances of psi phenomena which researchers have demonstrated. The theory does not need to fall back on vaguely defined possibilities within the realm of particle physics in order to seem plausible. Morphic resonance is instead, I would argue, a theory which synergizes with and is even implicated by various other significant and rigorous ideas such as those of emergent causation, bioelectricity, process philosophy, and the emerging field of quantum biology. From what we have examined thus far, it seems we can plausibly conclude that human minds, and in fact all organic processes in general, are able to interact with one another in non-local ways, which needn't be mediated by sensory interactions between bodies. This connects minds across both space and time, and it is through these kinds of influence that past mental activities are able to continually shape the present. As we expand our scope from interactions between specific minds to minds in general, what comes into focus is what we might call a collective consciousness. Carl Jung writes, quote, "In dreams, fantasies, and other exceptional states of mind, the most far-fetched mythological motifs and symbols can appear autochthonously at any time, often apparently as the result of particular influences, traditions, and excitations working on the individual, but more often without any sign of them. These primordial images, or archetypes as I have called them, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as personal acquisitions. Together they make up the psychic stratum, which has been called the collective unconscious." End quote. Carl Jung did not believe that these common psychological motifs could be explained merely as artifacts of cultural transmission, as he clearly states that oftentimes there is a conspicuous lack of evidence for such a mode of transmission. These archetypal motifs, in other words, seem to often manifest through individuals who should not even be consciously aware of their existence. Jung instead maintains that these archetypes must be understood as personalities which dwell within a fundamentally transpersonal, collective realm of the human psyche. As for how this collective psyche might come to influence an individual psyche without direct transmission, Jung remained mostly agnostic. Nevertheless, we can clearly see that such manifestations present a mystery, and one which I believe morphic resonance might help us to understand. Of course, it could be argued that the collective unconscious might be explained as something which is transmitted by the human genome. Yet we have already examined previously why that would be an immense overestimation of the actual power of the information found within DNA. To reiterate, DNA provides cells with the basic toolkits of proteins with which the cells are able to operate, but DNA does not encode the morphological information which actually shapes the organism as a whole. As such, it seems immensely unlikely that a complex web of primordial images, narrative motifs, mythological associations, and archetypal personalities could simply be contained within sequences of DNA. In case studies detailed in his book The Cosmic Game, Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof recounts experiments with altered states of consciousness, which he refers to as holotropic states. Within this research, subjects often reported highly detailed experiences of figures which Grof noted as strikingly similar to mythical and religious figures from cultures which the experimental subjects were themselves not familiar with. In one such instance, one of Grof's clinical patients had gone through a psychedelic therapy session in which the patient, who Grof refers to as Otto, stated that he had experienced vivid visions of a terrifying, pig-like goddess who guarded the entrance to the underworld. Otto had suffered from chronic death anxiety, and this experience seemed to be one in which he was brought into confrontation with this primordial fear. As the experience culminated, the patient opened his eyes and urgently asked Grof to bring him paper and writing utensils. Otto then began to sketch out elaborate geometrical patterns on the paper. Repeatedly, Otto would come to crumble up the paper and begin again on another sheet, as he felt an urgent need to, quote, get it right. Grof himself was baffled by the nature of this experience until he came to recount the events to his colleague, the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell. Campbell would identify the pig-like goddess as a mother goddess of night and death, found within the Malakulan culture of New Guinea. Grof explains, quote, the Malakulans had an elaborate system of rituals that involved breeding and sacrificing pigs. This complex ritual activity was aimed at overcoming the dependency on their human mothers and eventually on the devouring mother goddess. The Malakulans spent an enormous amount of time practicing the art of the labyrinth drawings, since its mastery was considered essential for the successful journey to the beyond." End quote. Through the lens of mechanistic thinking, such anomalies seem ridiculous. How could a person experience visions of mythological or religious imagery which the person has never personally encountered before? Although such mechanistic presumptions might incline us to write off these details as simply being strange coincidences, morphic resonance theory might instead indicate that these bizarre correspondences are instead the natural results of the fact that all human minds are, on various levels and to varying degrees, interwoven with one another within a very substantial collective unconscious, just as Carl Jung came to infer. Another provocative and bizarre phenomenon which may be indicative of morphic resonance comes from the realm of anthropology and ethnobotany. In his book Sapo in My Soul, The Matsés Frog Medicine, investigative journalist Peter Gorman recounts his experiences with the Matsés people of the Peruvian and Brazilian Amazon rainforest. Gorman, accompanied by his guide, Moises Viena, a specialist in jungle survival, sought to study and experience certain mind-altering medicinal substances used by the Matsés people, known as Sapo and Nunu. Sapo, also known as Cambo, is a substance used in medicinal cleansing rituals, while Nunu, on the other hand, is used as a kind of quasi-psychedelic stimulant used for hunting animals. Practitioners are said to use the substance Nunu in order to induce clairvoyant visions of animals within the forest, and to use these visions to track down or ambush prey. Within Sapo in My Soul, Gorman recounts his first experience with the strange, snuff-like substance and the seemingly inexplicable experiences which followed. Quote, "I closed my eyes. Out of the blackness I began to have visions of animals, tapirs, monkeys, wild boars, that I saw more clearly than my limited experience with them should have allowed. Suddenly, unexpectedly, a group of boars stamped in front of me. As I watched them thunder through my field of vision, several began to fall. Moments later, the visions faded, and a pleasant sense of drunkenness washed over me." Moises asked what I'd seen and whether I recognized the place where the vision happened. I told him it looked like the place where we'd eaten lunch earlier in the day. He asked what time it was in the vision, and I told him that the sun was shining but mist still shrouded the trees. He put the time between 7 and 8 a.m. Despite my suspicion that I'd invented the entire vision, Moises told the Matsés what I had seen. Gorman goes on to recount that he and the Matsés then traveled to the location he believed he had seen within his visions at dawn the next morning. To his surprise, they did indeed find a pack of wild boars, several of which the Matsés were able to successfully slay. Gorman goes on to conclude, quote, "Improbable as it seemed, the scene was close enough to what I described that there was no denying the veracity of the vision. I later asked how Nunu worked. Pablo explained in a mix of hand signals, Matsés, and Pidgin Spanish that Nunu put you in touch with the animals. He said the animals' spirits also see the visions and know what awaits them. He spoke as though I were a slow child, with everyone but my brother-in-law and myself already knowing what he was saying. For my part, I'll never understand how Nunu works, but I've witnessed the success of its visions so frequently that I don't question what's seen in them." End quote. Strange, anomalous phenomena and experiences such as those we have examined in this video are overall actually quite immensely ubiquitous. Although it may be possible to explain any one of these strange cases individually in a way that involves only mechanistic causation, when one attempts to apply such explanation to the whole of such accounts, it begins to become rather clear that explaining away such phenomena would require far more elaborate and improbable mental gymnastics than simply attempting to actually explain them as legitimate phenomena. Regarding the reported effects of Nunu, it seems to me most likely that the substance may act by disassociating certain mental processes within the mind of practitioners from their sensory orientation towards their imminent physical surroundings. No longer conditioned primarily by these immediate sensory stimuli, these mental processes are then able to act as something like a radio antenna, which is shaped by the influences of mental processes happening within the surrounding forest. As previously indicated, morphic resonance itself should operate independently of time and space. But, as Sheldrake also notes, it is also the case that our physical surroundings can condition the way in which our minds navigate the morphological spaces of consciousness. Religious architecture, for example, seems to actively take advantage of this. The environmental context of a religious building and the ritualized practices performed within that space may be able to guide one's mental processes into morphological spaces which have been carved out, as it were, by the experiences of other religious practitioners. Physical spaces, in other words, may entangle us with psychical spaces which are affiliated with them, and this may be why the effects of Nunu allow one to tune into animals within the surrounding Amazon rainforest rather than those of, say, the African savanna. Such an explanation may also cast light on why set and setting, as it is said, are so significant regarding the use of mind-altering substances. Where one is can have a very real impact on where one goes, and we might also expect that certain substances, such as Nunu, might only be able to produce their full effects within the natural environments of the plants themselves, in this case being the Amazon rainforest. Through morphic resonance, a person is able to tune into the experiences being had by nearby animals, as the minds of the animals themselves are navigating a very similar psychical landscape, as it were. One can then use this reception to then determine where the animals are. This explanation would also accord with the sense of pleasant drunkenness which Gorman recounted, as this could be a sort of anesthetic effect which results from the disconnection of the mind from sensory stimulations. In Process and Reality, Whitehead says the following with regards to the telepathic influences which he had theorized as hybrid prehensions. Quote, "Of course, such immediate objectification, that is, hybrid or telepathic influence, is also reinforced or weakened by mediate objectification, that is, sensory or bodily influences. It will only be in exceptional circumstances that an immediate hybrid or telepathic prehension has sufficiently vivid definition to receive a subjective form of clear conscious attention." End quote. In other words, although such telepathic influences might constantly be at work, it is only under exceptional circumstances that such influences might be disentangled from other physical sensory cognitive processes at work within our minds. Perhaps substances such as Nunu are used specifically due to their capacity to induce such exceptional circumstances. However, we must also note that Gorman's experience seemed to be in some sense clairvoyant as much as telepathic. He experienced where this pack of wild boars would be the next morning, not where they presently were. We might explain this by saying that Gorman was experiencing the animal's intentions in the present rather than a future event which had not yet occurred. He was receiving what the animals planned to do rather than what they were actively doing. Another possibility is that Gorman was actually experiencing a memory rather than the future event itself. If traveling through the location was something that the pack of wild boars was in a habit of doing on a regular basis, then it may be that Gorman tuned into the presence of that habit within the boars' minds because they were soon to repeat it. This explanation, however, would seem to beg the question as to why the Matsés people of that area weren't already aware of that tendency beforehand. As such, I think this nuance might suggest the workings of an even more subtle and mysterious factor. Within the book Morphic Resonance, The Nature of Formative Causation, Sheldrake addresses the possibility that morphic resonance might somehow be able to act retroactively, that future events might be able to influence events in the present. Sheldrake acknowledges this possibility but sets it aside in an effort not to unnecessarily complicate the hypothesis. It does seem somewhat outlandish that the future could influence the past, as future events have, by definition, not yet occurred, but upon further examination, I think we might find that this possibility isn't as ridiculous as it might first seem. In a sense, future events shape the present all the time. In ordinary life, we are constantly imagining scenarios and then taking the steps needed to actualize them. Whenever we strive to bring about a certain possibility, it could be said that a certain structure of as-yet unrealized potentiality is giving shape to the present by luring the world towards it. Although I do not think that the future is so predetermined that it is in effect already set in stone, I do think it might be possible that certain future events are so overdetermined by the present that they are, in a sense, already actual, already pulling processes in the present towards their eventual manifestation, and therefore, perhaps, able to be cognized through a kind of retrocausal morphic resonance. In a study published in 2003 in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, researchers found that just under half of participants reported having had experiences of knowing something about the future in a seemingly precognitive manner, and over 40% reported experiencing dreams which seemed to provide information about events which had yet to occur. Although precognition might at first seem fantastical, it may very well be that the precognitive experiences induced by substances such as Nunu might very well be more accentuated instances of processes which are actually at work in ordinary human life on a regular basis, but which mostly lie beneath the surface of our ordinary sensory awareness. In creating this video, my intention was to present viewers with a depiction of the world which might appear to be immensely radical or even outlandish, especially for those who are more intellectually inclined and thus more likely to have been more thoroughly shaped by the mechanistic paradigm of scientific thought which has come to dominance over the course of the past 2.5 centuries. I believe that Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance is able to disclose aspects of our reality within which we are ever entangled. Aspects of our reality which are ever present, but which have become occulted by the manner in which mechanistic, materialistic thinking has blinded us to the features of the world which precede and transcend the physical and the sensory. In presenting these ideas, I've attempted to illustrate the manner in which this theory can be seen as an extension of the more philosophical and metaphysical reconceptualizations of the world which have been developed within the field of process philosophy. My attempt was as much to be suggestive as argumentative, as I believe that ultimately morphic resonance is not simply one fringe theory among others to be accepted or discarded on the basis of specific experiments or arguments, but rather is one, albeit very crucial, thread within a much bigger tapestry which is itself a revaluation of our understanding of nature at the most fundamental levels. Through contextualizing morphic resonance alongside the metaphysical systems of process philosophy and alongside recent advances in bioelectric developmental biology, I've attempted to articulate the suggestion that these various threads all hang together as a complete string figure, which is in fact a paradigm shift. That is, a reworking of our understanding of nature at large through a reframing of the fundamental metaphors which condition the morphology of our epistemological horizons. Advances in biology continue to fracture the selfish gene model of evolutionary theory. Advances in Psi research continue to become more and more difficult to dismiss or explain away. New observations made by technologies such as the James Webb Space Telescope continue to show that standard cosmology is simply unable to accord with the world which we actually find ourselves within. As these issues continue to compound, these crises within our prevailing scientific paradigm will culminate in a gradual yet monumental revolution within our overall understanding of the world, one which I believe will result in a much overdue transition from a mechanistic cosmology to an organic cosmology, as thinkers such as Bergson, Whitehead, Sheldrake, and many others have attempted to envision.